to executive in the early March executive meeting. The carbon neutrality action plan, which we have an extract from, was included in that. A climate change strategy paper was included in that, and some targets for both for the borough and for Waverley's own operations were included there. So if you want to follow up on some of this, including the breakdown of emissions by service area, that's all included there. So right, okay, so I've got a few comments stemming from this. I mean, firstly, I'd like to congratulate the officers for actually having the breakdown of carbon saving or carbon removal. Most of the other service areas haven't got to that stage yet, so it's good that there's a bit of scientific rigour going into the housing area, which is entirely appropriate because we are the biggest emitter, unfortunately, so we've got the biggest challenge. It's good to understand it. Against Project 121 in this list of potential projects, this committee is listed as down to work with officers to update the housing design standards, and the start date there is listed as March 2020, which of course is now, and that's clearly not going to happen. But I think we're probably all in agreement that this is a piece of work that is both important and needs to happen, and those of us that were involved in the previous exercise will testify to the fact that it was a hugely satisfying exercise, and it was a very good opportunity to see just all the hard work that officers go to make sure that Waverley's houses are some of the best around. You know, they compare extremely favourably with the private sector. Often we produce houses that are better than the private sector, and we do that in a cost-sensitive way. So that's hugely important. So I'd like to suggest that we aim to start this work probably immediately after the summer holidays and do it as a 3Q exercise, because there are some other pieces of work that we do need to do before that. And I'd like to encourage members of this committee to think very hard about getting involved in that exercise. I did it last time, Councillor Ellis was involved. We had an absolutely superb time. We had a member from the tenants panel, we went out on site visits, and the fruits of our labour are coming to fruition on Oxford Ridge. So you get to actually see what you've done, and hopefully Oxford Ridge Site C will be even better than the houses that have already been built. And if not, well, we'll step down and leave it to more able people next time round. Also relating to Project 121, the project description states that the task will include opportunities to building carbon neutral passive house homes. I'm not sure that passive house actually gets us to full carbon neutrality, and as was mentioned, we've also seen the Thacum presentation, which says there are actually other solutions for making a significant impact on reducing carbon in our housing. So my personal view is that Waverley would be wise to trial several options in order to test cost effectiveness and the ease of construction before we actually commit to a single standard. And I don't think we'd be wanting to commit to any internal standards until we've actually had a really good look at some of the alternatives for those reasons. So I mean, perhaps Louisa would care to comment on those thoughts, but I think it might be appropriate to have the word passive house removed from this plan, just so that we don't tie ourselves down to something that we don't actually know for a fact is going to be the right answer.
Yeah, I think that the passive house standard is just one specific standard, and I think the review needs to work to look at the levels of carbon emissions against the building regulations and come up with a way that we're going to achieve a more efficient home, not tied to any particular model.
Thank you. So perhaps we could record that in the minutes that we'll be asking for passive house to be removed and some sense of more generality included in Project 121. And then the third point I wanted to bring up was taking up the gauntlet from Councillor Ellis's comment. Amlet's Lane was super, but if you want to get to school, hospitals, leisure facilities, shops. You've got to get in a car. And getting in cars is just not good. The government statistics on emissions from Waverley, which are included, or at least accessible through the material presented to Executive, showed numbers between 2005 and 17 broken down into 3 categories. So for commercial and industrial emissions, the numbers are actually coming down very nicely of their own accord. And if you assume linearity, commercial and industrial emissions are going to get fairly close to zero by around about 2030. I'm not sure it's reasonable to assume that will happen, but that's what the data show at the moment. The next category is housing, which is coming down comfortably, although it's on a trajectory to hit zero around about 2050. But the one area where nothing much is happening is in transport. The figure between 2005 and 2017 for transport emissions for Waverley as a borough is fairly flat. And that suggests to me that we ought to be doing everything we possibly can around sustainability to just getting cars off the road. So I'd very much like to see a piece of work done, which this committee I think could get involved in, around looking at possibly something like a sustainability index for properties. And then the 2 places where that could be applied. I mean, firstly, one's in the building or the buying of properties through Section 106. Can we see maybe if we have a choice of locations, then maybe some are better than others in terms of reducing the amount of transport needed to get people to where they need to be. We've got to look for something radical. It's not easy. I fully appreciate this is not easy, but I think it's something that's at least worth giving consideration. And then also with our allocations policy, again, at the moment, principal concern is getting roofs over people's heads, and that's absolutely right. But, is there an option to actually consider if you've got 2 families, one that lives in Cranley and one lives in Farnham, would it be right to have the family living in Cranley commuting to work in Farnham and vice versa? Maybe we could just be a little bit smarter about this. I don't know, but I'd like to throw it open to colleagues. Does that seem like a sensible thing to worry about? Or am I just casting out a notion that's maybe way too difficult? Councillor Cole.
It's a very difficult thing. I mean, I understand Councillor Ayres' point, but of the housing sites have been approved in Cranley in the last period, only 1, perhaps 2 would meet the criterion of being a walking distance from the shops. So I think while it's a nice thing to achieve, I just don't think maybe we can get some value out of it, but it has to be way more complex than can I walk to the shops, because most housing sites will fail on that basis.
Louisa?
I can just add, as maybe part of our review of our design standards, we can look at the Building for Life criteria, which includes that type of isolation and location and transport to towns. And it's a number of 12 items that you can assess against.
Okay, well, that's an excellent constructive suggestion. I think that would be a good way forward. It might just come into the totally too difficult category, but getting transport emissions down in Waverley is going to need something that's that's currently in the too difficult category, because they're just not moving. Councillor Baker.
Thank you. I've been thinking about this business of transport within Waverley. If we're talking about the emissions, then we should not really just be looking at housing sites, the provision of new housing sites by the housing department. I mean, were you suggesting that, or were you thinking about the settlements in Waverley overall?
No, I was just sticking to the remit of this committee, the things we actually have some control over. You're absolutely right, there are lots of other things that could be looked after, but as far as this committee is concerned, what could our contribution be to getting that unbudgeable transport emissions number down and you know, improving having people closer to where they need to be without the use of cars is one potential area.
Could I come back on that? Simply because, I mean, we don't normally hear descend from the strategic to the detailed, but just to give you an idea of what I've been thinking about, I've been thinking that if we had a half-hour minibus service from Hambledon down to this end of Godalming, I think it will be well used. But I say this because I think that that has led me on to think that Waverley needs to have a group, a working party possibly, to look at the problems of transport within the borough generally. It would, of course, be a Surrey County Council matter, but sometimes I think it's better for us to start here in Waverley and see if we can get some ideas worked up. And you're talking about quite radical change, but we have to do it. We have to make changes, so I think we have to think the unthinkable and do things that we would never have considered doing before. I just throw this in because I've started from my own village, which I don't represent here anyway, but it is something I've been thinking about. Thank you.
So thank you for those comments, and I'll refer you back to the papers that were put to the executive, so that the first part of this carbon neutrality plan actually does include items at the borough level which will involve working with other parties. My comments were really addressed at the items that this committee has some control over, but the thoughts are there. Any more comments on that particular item? Councillor Hyman?
Yes, just interested to know what the, I don't really want a detailed answer now, but you might know that I look at the assumptions of what we're, how many tonnes of carbon dioxide are going to be saved by, for instance, changing to LED bulbs. Now, I thought I was going to save heaps and heaps of money when I changed to fluorescent, bulbs instead of the old-fashioned tungsten ones. And I haven't saved masses of money on my electricity bill, so I probably haven't saved millions of tonnes of carbon dioxide either, because the two would be linked in some way. And we've got an assumption here, and we've got various assumptions here that where we're saying we're going to save an awful lot. And now, presumably these come, somebody somewhere has worked it out, and we're piggybacking into some work that's been done around the world on how much you can save by doing various things. Or did we have somebody sit down and work each out individually? How many bulbs do we have to? Are we assuming we're changing from Wolfram filaments to LEDs in every room? And the costs of doing this. To what extent do we have this in detail at the moment as to the, because I'm slightly concerned about where you're saying that we've got 15 to 30 grand per unit costs in sort of going as climate friendly as this would require. I think that's what we're being told, isn't it? Is that just on the extra cost on new builds? Or would that apply as a sort of cost of upgrading every home that we've got? I've looked through this enough. I don't pretend to obviously to have any sort of depth of knowledge into the background of it, and I don't think tonight's the place for you to try and give us that depth of knowledge. I'm sure you've got it, but if you can just give me some idea of whether we are really seriously looking at being able to do this, if we've got to spend 15 to 30 grand on each property in order to be able to do it, but perhaps how we're going to fund it, particularly if coronavirus crashes everybody's economy.
I mean, I think we've got to be clear, anything in these two action plans are funded from tenants' rents, basically. So I think we need to take that into account when we make strategic decisions on spending. The 20,000 was something that Andrew mentioned in terms of an estimate, in terms of bringing new extra cost of new build to bring them up to this standard. What we haven't priced here is, and the Chair has pointed this out, is the cost of the proposals that I've put in for the housing operations. So that needs to be costed. And I think you said quite a key thing that we could turn, and I think the Chair mentioned this earlier, that we cost how much it is per pound for each saving that we make, and break it down into some kind of easy, understandable KPI or performance indicator, I think, going forward. But I think the advantage of doing this investment, as I mentioned earlier, would be cheaper utility bills for residents, having safer homes, even more warm homes. So there would be that benefit, but I think it is around the investment will come from people's rents, and that's why when we see the asset management strategy, when it comes here, this committee will see what priorities have been set and whether it's appropriate to do those kind of investments. But a lot of the investments we've done in the past to get the reduction was to actually keep maintaining the building, i.e. the windows, new boilers. We had to fit new boilers any case. So a lot of these costs we would have to spend any case, if you see what I mean. If we want to keep our homes up to a certain standard, we may have to pay some slightly extra money to bring them up to an even higher standard in terms of energy efficiency. But we're constantly investing in our homes, and the spin-off has been a reduction in CO2 emissions.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. Right, so there's no recommendation associated with this particular item, but we've made some comments which hopefully are captured and can be passed on to the executive. This draft action plan and the draft strategy and the draft performance targets have been approved by the executive and are due to come to us in council in April, with clear recognition that there's a lot of work to be done yet in terms of costing, and the aim is to have some numbers for that probably by September. So we'd very much like for progress on this to be reported back to this committee as things go along, and we'd like to see it at subsequent meetings. Is everyone comfortable with that? Great. Okay, thank you very much. Right, so item 9 is the housing allocation schemes update, and we've got Mike Rivers with us this evening to introduce the item. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, the purpose of this report really is to give members of this committee an update on the role of Waverley's allocation scheme. So if I just sort of summarise really what the purpose of an allocation scheme is, all councils are required to have an allocation scheme to determine how the social housing within the boroughs or districts is allocated. So it's a legal requirement, quite a complex legal requirement, because there's a lot of laws that we have to abide by in producing an allocation scheme, particularly in regard to eligibility in terms of immigration status, people returning from abroad, people having recourse to public funds. So it's quite a complex area. There are legal requirements in terms of how we assess the need in terms of giving priority to certain needs. For example, people who are homeless are required to be given what's called a reasonable preference. People with medical needs, housing needs, overcrowding are also required to be given a level of priority. So councils have this responsibility upon them, and it's then down to the councils to produce a legally compliant document to explain to the community how we are going to balance all those different needs in terms of allocating social housing. And just to emphasise, so the social housing, that would be the council's own stock, but it will also be 75% of the housing association stock within our borough, and 100% of that housing association stock when they're new build. Any subsequent lets generally at 75%. So it covers council and housing association. So the report outlines that we have what is called a banding scheme. Basically, councils either choose to have what's called a point scheme, where you have a lot of build up of points to determine priority, or you have a broader brush approach, which is known as a banding scheme. So we have what's called a banding scheme, 3 priority bands of A to C, and then a lower band called the discretionary pool that is used, for example, if we felt it was if we had hard to let stock, particularly some of our senior living stock is harder to let. So sometimes that allows us to have a bit more flexibility in terms of who can go on the register so that we can let that less demand stock. So since 2013, we've had an allocation scheme which we've had to amend in small ways as the government brings in new legislation. And the way we amend it is by taking a recommendation document to the portfolio holder and to the head of housing. And so since 2013, our allocation scheme has had about 15 minor changes through that time. But we thought that because it's since 2013, since all members have seen the allocation scheme, we thought it would be good to bring it through the committee process so that members can see the up-to-date scheme. And basically what I'm trying to do in the report is just to point out some of the balancing act that we have to do. We have to be legally compliant, and yet we can also use the allocation scheme to help, for example, recover debt and emphasise personal responsibility. It very much helps us in our homeless prevention approach. Members will be aware that we've had a very successful number of years in terms of keeping numbers in temporary accommodation particularly low, and the allocation scheme plays its part in enabling us to do that. The allocation scheme also helps us have what's called balanced communities. There's a section within the report where I talk about if you just concentrated the needs so much in certain size accommodation to the highest need without a broader brush approach, you can then concentrate deprivation in particular estates. And I think certainly the feedback from my colleagues in housing management is since we've had this allocation scheme in place really since 2007, it's been just gone through a series of changes. It really has helped Waverley's estates to have more of a balance in terms of people in employment, people not in employment, people reliant on benefits, people not reliant on benefits. And so it's just really trying to get that balance and meeting housing need, helping us prevent homelessness. So I'll sort of end it there and open it up for questions, but I just thought that would be a useful introduction to the purpose of the report. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. If I could just come in, there were 2 sort of triggers for this. One was an internal audit that we had on aspects of the allocation scheme. One of the recommendations was that it should be examined again through the committee process. And the second thing, that there were some objectives that came out of our Pride or Prejudice work, which Annalisa might be able to outline a little more fully to remind particularly members of the committee that are new. So there were a couple of triggers, as well as it is a weighty, very important sort of document, and it's really good for this committee to have a handle on it, see what the committee thinks, and if the committee wishes in any way to look at various aspects of the allocations policy and improve it, because not only do we have the government legislation that instructs us to change it, there could be ways in which we can make it work much better for our residents.
Thank you. Annalisa, do you want to chip in there?
Yes, just to give a summary from the Pride or Prejudice piece of work that this committee completed. We looked at who social housing was for in the borough. We spoke to current tenants, people on the housing register, the general population, did a range of focus groups and online questionnaires. And one of the biggest things that came out of that was that the general population wasn't aware that social housing was there for anybody who the market wasn't meeting their housing need. And there was a real misunderstanding about who social housing was for. Anybody who earns less than £60,000 a year can apply for social housing. And that's something that we really want to promote, and the Pride or Prejudice piece of work recommended that we should really advertise and promote and make it much easier for people to register their housing need with the borough, so that we've got that true picture of the housing need in the borough, and also supporting people who want to live and work locally and provide essential services to people in the borough. Thank you.
Right, so that provides a useful introduction. Do members want to comment? Councillor Hyman?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think that's the 60 grand a year level is household income, isn't it? Not personal income necessarily. So that's a household income limit that we've got. Incredibly useful. I did, if you go through agenda item 9 and read through there, you get a bit of background of it. You then go through the summary that's there, and you think that's a really good summary, actually. And then you go through the whole of the 68 pages. By now, it's become torturous, of course, because you've just done 100-odd pages of the same thing 3 times over, but in great detail. By necessity, of course, it is, but it is torturous. It is very good. It's very well written in some areas, as Richard and I were talking about this earlier. There's a lot of bits and pieces in there that need to be looked at over the years, just from minor typos here and there and everything. You note on the contents page that there's no page number against section 17. That's because there isn't a section 17, because there's 2 section 16s, and there's bits and pieces like that we can play with to tidy it up. There's lots of things through there which I think need to be, where we can make it clearer. Many years since, 7 years since 2013, obviously little changes here and there have been done, and I've picked up a few things where it looks like it's gone wrong. But I think we don't want to go into detail on that. I've got 2 pages of notes here on different things which I found going through it, but it's a very, very good policy as far as I'm concerned, and it reads very well. So, but I think we can make it better and shorten it a bit. We don't need to repeat everything. I wondered what tenants are meant to read when they are taking on a tenancy. Do we give them the short version, the summary, and do they read that? Do we give them the 68-page version and say, read that, and if you don't, your tenancy is in jeopardy because you won't know what the rules are? I can't imagine that many councillors have actually read through and understood really properly read the whole of the 68-page document. So I think it would be nice if we can bring that down in size. There are quite a lot of bits repeated in there, and I think we could just make it a bit tidier. If, Chairman, you wouldn't mind recommending that we have some sort of workshop or whatever with officers at some point, like you suggested, that would be handy. I really don't think anybody wants to go into the sort of detail tonight which this deserves. It's mandatory, the allocation scheme. We've got to have one anyway, and it's useful. And I think it would be worth us putting a little bit more effort into it so that we have something which we can put in front of our tenants if they really want to know what's going on without killing them, making their eyes bleed. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Hyman. I'm in total agreement with you. I think that this is far too complicated, largely because it's heavily driven by legislation. It's too complicated for a debate in this session. And you suggest we have a working session. We've been working down that line with officers, and I'd like to suggest that when we get to the work programme session at the end of this meeting, we try and schedule 1 or 2 meetings with officers, possibly whole morning sessions with cups of tea and biscuits, and get officers to take us through this fairly complicated scheme, and factor in the items that Annalisa's raised that arose from the Pride or Prejudice area, because we're building vast numbers of houses in Waverley, and those houses are going to have to be have access to services. We're going to need teachers, we're going to need nurses, we're going to need people working in shops, and frankly, it's by and large, it's too expensive to live in Waverley when you're doing those kind of jobs, and yet we're not going to be able to carry on the way we're carrying on if we don't do something about it. And, you know, with a cap of £60,000 household income, we can, you know, you can get a family of young teachers, a couple of young teachers moving into a house. We need to make sure that the allocation scheme is set up to allow that to happen, so that the sustainability of the whole borough is continued. So when we get to recommendations at the end, I will be suggesting that when we come to the work programme at the end, we schedule some time to get officers to take us through this in more detail and give it the time it deserves. Right, Councillor Baker.
Thank you. Well, I'll try not to stray into detail in that case. I have a question and a comment, actually. I was interested to hear that older living schemes were harder to let. So I'd really like to have an understanding of why that is the case, especially as I feel quite elderly at the moment. I also would like to refer to something on page 78, which is actually something that comes out of the Pride or Prejudice review, and that is picking up what the chairman has just said about local workers. And I have seen here that I have not seen the phrase key worker anywhere, and I'm assuming that that would be covered in the normal allocations policy. But if you look at little b, forgive me for going into detail, applicants who work locally accrue a local connection to Waverley, but that is after a period of time. So, for instance, if we as a council wanted to recruit somebody and they couldn't afford to live here, then we lose somebody who might be a very good applicant for a vacancy. So I'd quite like to know how that is handled.
Yeah, it's always tricky with what are the local connection rules. So currently the policy's position is that someone needs to be working at least 16 hours a week in permanent employment, and that employment to have been in the borough for at least a year before being eligible to go onto the register. I guess that's to guard against someone maybe having a job, and then it doesn't work out for whatever reason, and so rather than accruing a local connection straight away, at least there's that element of that job being sustained for that period of time. It is interesting in terms of go back to the chairman's points about particularly about key workers as well. Because I think there was a lot of debate about key workers within the housing circles probably about 10 years ago. And I think where it got incredibly complicated is the definition of what is a key worker, because at the time it was the police, nurses, fire service, but then it started to evolve around, well, what about people that staff care homes and all that? And so it got very complex. And so in a sense, what a lot of councils did, including Waverley, is we did it really round income, so that people, as long as people can meet, don't fall foul of our income rules, then in a sense we can accommodate, from the lowest paid up to a certain level, which in our case is the household income of 60,000, which would capture the key workers as well. Obviously, if that was felt that threshold should be higher, then you will potentially attract more applicants to register, but then you're making a longer wait for social housing. So the more people we have on the register, the wider we cast the net, people have to wait longer, and that could also impact our homelessness performance, because it's, again, what the report is trying to say is it is a very fine balance. But obviously we would absolutely welcome members' comments on it, because as I say, it's since 2013 that all members have seen it. We certainly want to correct minor typos, but also other aspects, and also to point out in terms of rewriting it, because of the new standards for all documents that need to go onto the website, We will, across departments, Waverley, we need to look at all of our policy documents to make sure that they read correctly on the website. And so that will also be an opportunity where we can actually reconfigure what is in the policy to make sure it reads correctly and it's particularly disability compliant for when people are looking at it on a website and they're reliant on it, a voice activated description of it for people who are partially sighted. So I think that aspect will actually be picked up certainly within the next few months because we have to do that by September. Hope that helps anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. I think definitely we need a workshop. Thank you.
Terry?
40 years ago, I was known as a key worker, so, but I presume that's changed since then. But I'd like to ask just a couple of questions, really. It's on the process of when you get to the viewing and being offered, and you've got some timelines and days that you've got to do things. And I can give an example that last year, a relative of mine, a young relative of mine that didn't live in this particular borough, but was offered accommodation whilst they were on holiday in Cornwall, which resulted in that lad returning from Cornwall to view the house because he was told he had to view it the next day and had to make the decision by 10 o'clock the next morning as to whether he wanted that accommodation without his wife seeing that. And I think that's quite unfair because, people will be on a holiday and it's like, hopefully that flexibility in Waverley is there.
Yeah, I can comment on that. It is a fine balance because, we have social housing. We ask people to bid for it through our choice-based letting scheme, and so they express a preference for it, and then we will arrange a viewing when it is ready to let. But the timescales are very short, and that is really to maximise the rental income because we, in terms of, so it is a hard balance because we want to maximise income and we want to meet the housing need, and we have for every property. Probably on average, we have like 30 bids, so they're in high demand, and so it is a difficult balance, and I think there would be an impact if we were to, if there were exceptional circumstances, we can maybe, we have to have some sort of flexibility, but generally we need to stick to quite a rigid time frame to maximise the rental income and prevent the void loss. So that's why. Yeah.
So I'm just about to come back. Yeah, I can understand that the need for promptness, but can we say that the house that is becoming available would that go on notice fairly early, maybe even before the people have moved from that or given up that particular property?
We will advertise properties once we're given the 4-week notice, because tenants are required to give us 4 weeks notice. So we advertise them then, so people can, it's known as placing a bid, it's expressing an interest in it, and then the system will rank them by priority order, and we will then shortlist them and contact the top people on the bidding list to arrange the viewing. We have to do a series of debt checks and verifications ourselves before we can make those offers. But then the timeline can get very quick. A lot would depend on, some properties will take quite a few weeks to bring into a lettable state, but most of them, our target is to let them within 20 days. So that's what we're trying to achieve all the time. And so it will vary. Some people will benefit from the fact that, they've given notice, they've been able to organise their removals and it fits in well with them. But others, it is a pressure, particularly those who are giving up private rented accommodation, because sometimes they're having to pay rent on a private rent and also move into our property because we can't afford for them to give a 2-month notice and for us to keep a property empty for 2 months. So it is difficult, yeah.
I understand that, but thank you.
Are there any further comments?
It's just going back to the senior living. I wouldn't quite say that they're hard to let because at any one time we've got an occupancy rate around 99%. So just to give you that reassurance, we do have some bed sits, which may be more difficult to let. But I think it really goes back to this point, is that for older people, sometimes they're not going to jump at the chance of sheltered housing because perhaps they've been in their family home for 20, 30, 40 years. So it does take some persuasion perhaps to move them, some support, which we have put in place to support people to downsize. But what we found, when people do downsize, it can transform their lives in moving into to our senior living schemes. And it's trying to relay that message and give people support to move. So just to reassure the councillor, they are popular when people move into them, and just to give you that reassurance.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. If I may ask a question, a number of years ago we used to give a financial incentive to people, perhaps to downsize. Can you confirm whether that is still in operation?
Yes, that is still in operation. It's an incentive if people are freeing up family-sized accommodation and moving to one-bedroom or senior living accommodation, and that is very useful, and it sort of helps. Particularly, it can make the difference for someone who's maybe a bit reluctant to move and about being able to afford the removal costs. At least gives them that assurance that they've got a bit of financial help with that. And we're desperate for family-sized accommodation, so we really want people to, to downsize so that we've got so many families that need family-sized accommodation. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I, ask a supplementary? I should have asked it. If somebody is moving from a housing association property to a Waverley property, do they have that same cash incentive?
We don't actually apply that for housing association properties. We only apply it for our own stock. So it is purely for freeing up Waverley accommodation. Obviously, there's a financial, and then it's coming from the housing revenue account, which is what is paying for that.
Okay, I've got just one question. On page 79, item 18 refers to highlighting efforts to reduce the carbon footprint in the administration of the allocation scheme. I struggled to find anything. Is there something in there somewhere?
It was about the work it's about the work we're trying to do in terms of reducing postage costs, reducing paper. The fact that we do choice-based lettings is a sort of digital way that people can go in. And under the previous regimes, we would write out to people with an offer of accommodation. Now we'll phone them up and just say, look, here's the offer of accommodation, following your successful bid. So it's all to do with that. And it is something that we're continuing to look at in terms of channel shifting and trying to do things more by email rather than written letter and post.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Right, there's a recommendation that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee is asked to note and comment on this report and the latest version of the Council's allocation scheme and agree any comments it wishes to pass to the Executive. So I think where we ended up was that we would like the opportunity to have 1 or 2 sessions with officers to better understand the way the scheme is being constructed and then possibly based on enhanced knowledge, make further comments at that point. So, yeah, that's great. That's agreed? Thank you. Excuse me. Item 10 was due to be on mental health and housing. The lead presenter on this was due to be Laura Dillon, who unfortunately is not well at the moment. So it's been suggested that rather than try and accommodate this item now, that we defer it until our next meeting so that Laura, who's manager for that particular area, has the opportunity to talk to us. I'd certainly welcome that. Is everyone agreed that we do go down that route? Agreed. Okay, thank you very much. So then we come on to item 11, which is housing maintenance, and it's the procurement of the responsive repairs and voids contract. So can I ask Hugh Wagstaff to introduce this for us, please? I beg. Momentum has carried me beyond where I was supposed to. Yes, I have a potential conflict here in that I chaired the previous review of this activity, and so I consider it far better that someone who doesn't have that baggage chair it. So I'm going to hand the chair over to Councillor Cole. Thank you very much.
Right, so we have a paper here in front of us which addresses the situation at the loss of the contract with MPS and what we do next. So you're going to present that, I'm sure you will, but you'll make it clear what we have to decide tonight and what we aren't deciding tonight.
Okay, so thank you very much. So yes, as the Chair mentioned, and we've reported to the committee a number of times, MPS gave us notice in November, and in that short period, we have appointed Ian Williams as our interim contractor and it's for until November 2021. That was to keep under the ODU limits, so we didn't have to go through the ODU process because of the shortage of time. The good news, I'd like to say, is that the contract has gone live this week, and for how you can measure it so far, it seems to have gone very well. So congratulations to Heather and her team who have worked enormously hard to achieve that and to give them their due, Ian Williams. So they're now doing the jobs. The interface between the two IT systems are working, and Ian Williams had their nice white gleaming vans outside the offices this morning. So that's all good. So we've only got so what this paper is about is what we do for the long term in terms of we've only got to November 2021 to put a new long-term delivery in place, and this is what this report is recommending, and it's going to the executive. And basically, the recommendations that we procure one contractor using a JCT contract with a main pricing mechanism, a schedule of rates, but at the same time also investigate whether we can use shared service with another local authority. And the other key recommendation to highlight is that this committee monitors the procurement process. Now, given the limited timescale for the 2021 procurement, there is it's 2020-21 procurement. There's no opportunity, I would recommend, to complete a comprehensive options appraisal as the committee did in the previous procurement. So, however, the team, we have reviewed that appraisal that the councillors mentioned in the 2017 appraisal, which considered all the delivery options, and officers feel that there were no significant changes in the circumstances since that report. So hence, we are recommending to the executive via this committee that we should just go for a procurement model of one contractor, but at the same time seeing if we can actually work with another local authority at the same time. As I say, the time limit is very tight, so we need to actually set ourselves on the way forward. And in terms of this committee monitoring the procurement process, what we're suggesting is that we have a special session where we look at the lessons learned from the last procurement, any changes that we wish to consider within the procurement process and within the contract, and then that feeds in to the tendering documents that we're looking to use going forward. So the key thing that this committee needs to agree is the recommendation around procuring a contract rather than investigating in depth other delivery options. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So, as you just said, tonight we're not trying to obviously select a contractor. We're not trying to write the tender document, but we are being asked to agree that the process that was followed last time, in terms of the process of going in and the schemes that the baseline schemes remain appropriate. So I guess if we thought that what happened last time was a complete disaster, it was doomed from the start, then we shouldn't agree it again. Now, if we don't think it was a disaster and it was a fair way of going forward, and the failure was due, at least in principle, to what happened with the contractor, then we should recommend this. But any comments from councillors on this, particularly in terms of the recommendations for this evening? Councillor Harman.
Chairman, just for the benefit of anybody who was watching the silent movie earlier on and is still there with us, sat at home in isolation with Laura, presumably, nothing better to do. This, we did have a 1 hour briefing on this before this meeting, so that we don't have to spend an hour on it now. We've gone into it in a reasonable amount of depth, and officers were very helpful and answered all our questions. As far as I'm concerned, there isn't a great deal. I don't know whether there's anything that we ought to discuss in public on this issue, just so that people think that, that we've can see that we are taking it seriously. It's a very serious matter. There were mistakes obviously made, or at least the outcome of the last procurement exercise wasn't happy. We want people to know that we're looking at it carefully. I can't help myself but look at paragraph 1.3. If you want to know what we're doing, I don't want to give people the impression that we don't know what we're doing. It says, the purpose of this report seek the executives to progress procurement, which I think somebody should have had a bit more water in it when they wrote that one. But the recommendation's clear enough. We're going to go through a process that is absolutely necessary. We've got Ian Williams, which is a Welsh company, we're told, and successful around other areas, working on the contract now for us. And this is for the longer-term contract. We do have to go through the processes, and the recommendations basically make sure we do our very best to ensure that the executive do it properly, and that we keep our eye on it throughout, and I'm very supportive of the recommendations. Thank you, Chairman.
Any other member want to make any comment before we go to the recommendation? Councillor Baker.
Yes, thank you. The whole sort of options process that was gone through, can I be reminded what the title of that process was, that we are not going to use this time?
I'm going to use it, but it's the
previous review of a whole range of options into procurement that was done last time, and what Mr. Wagstaff is saying is, having done it in depth last time, which was not that long ago, there's no benefit in redoing it. What I would say in relation to what Councillor Hyman said, though, there's always learning when we go through these large exercises, but I don't believe officers made any mistakes, and I don't believe members made any errors in this case. I think what happened with MPS reflects a national situation across the UK, and if you look at other similar contracts, similar contractors, including MPS, have done similar things and pulled out of contracts. And I think it's just reflects the state of the market rather than any error on our behalf.
So could I just come back on that?
Go ahead, yeah.
So if we are looking at presumably one option now, but we're also considering going with having a combined operation with another authority, would we need to, we would have to have something that was harmonious. So would it mean that we might actually have to look at something other than the option that we have been working with? I hope I've made sense.
What the paper is suggesting is very similar to what we did with the waste contract, which is twin track them. We know at which point we can pull out of either process, but there'll be 2 options rolling forward, and we'll just see what they look like in terms of the value that we can get out of them. And at a point, and we'll work out when those strict break points are, which you probably know now, where we have to go for one or the other option in terms of either some sort of partnership, some halfway house, or straight procurement. Leaves the options open whilst ensuring that we get good value for the tenant's money.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
If I may, Chairman, only to say that, yes, absolutely, I agree with Annie Wright and what she says there, that there is no finger pointing of blame at anyone in this, because the same contractor did the same thing to other people. It's the sort of thing that has been happening over the past year or two. There are always difficulties with these with responsive repairs contracts historically. They are very difficult to get right, and all councils and housing associations have the same sort of problems, particularly when, like Waverley, we are trying to get as much bang for our buck as possible, which we always try to do, and that never makes life easy for us or the contractors. So unless we're going to start simply throwing money at the problem, which isn't really an option, we have got a duty to the tenants and the housing revenue account, then you know, we have to go through this procedure, and we have to hope that in the end the contractors are able to deliver what they said they could during the contract, and let's hope that this time we have a little bit more luck than last time, but it is to some extent out of our control.
Of course, we'll see it again quite shortly when we come to the period of consultation. So,
but these recommendations, I think, that are in front of us, just reflect that we're doing our best to make sure that we do get a better outcome this time.
I think I will read out the recommendations. It is rather complex, but so it is recommended that the executive agrees the recommended approach to procuring delivery of housing, maintenance, responsive repairs, improvements, void refurbishment, and disabled adaptation services. That authority be delegated to the head of housing operations in consultation with the portfolio holder for housing, strategic director, and section 151 officer to appoint consultants to provide advice and undertake such work relevant to achieve the recommendations. And 2.2, procure and recommend to contractors to deliver responsive repairs, improvements, void refurbishment, and disabled adaptation works within agreed budgets in accordance with the Council's contract procurement rules. And finally, requests that the Overview and Scrutiny Coordinating Board adds the ongoing monitoring of the procurement process to the Overview and Scrutiny work programme. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Councillor Cole, for chairing that piece. And thanks, colleagues. Final item on this evening's agenda then is the committee work programme. So if I could hand the floor over to Yasmin to take us through that. We've discussed quite a lot of work tonight, so in the next 5 minutes we'll probably be getting that into some kind of order and determining exactly what we're going to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So as you say, we've discussed a lot of in-depth work this committee could be doing in the future. So I just wanted to run through that and consult the committee on how that might go. So we've talked about the lessons learned in the previous item, lessons learned from the procurement exercise. And as Annie said, there's always going to be lessons learned, no matter if there was a mistake by us or not. I wanted to put to the committee, we've discussed this previously, about having a few in-depth sessions, some discrete pieces of work to look at those lessons learnt as a matter of priority, because obviously this exercise is under a strict timeline. So that was the first piece of work I wanted to suggest the committee might want to nominate members to. We've also discussed the housing design standards in light of the climate emergency declaration. And we've touched upon the work that this committee could do in developing the energy efficiency spec attached to those housing design standards. So that's another piece of work this committee could do. And I think you mentioned earlier, Chairman, that that could begin soon after summer holidays, around the September time, which tallies quite nicely because we've got a committee meeting then. And thirdly, we talked about the allocation scheme and the work that could be done around that strategically in terms of is it the right are we asking the right questions of our, is it strategic? Sorry, is it asking, are we happy with the policy within it, I suppose? Are we happy with the content of it, but also that Mike already also mentioned that deadline by September of the audio description as well, so that's quite important too. The committee can have a role in that. So those are 3 pieces of work that I suggest the committee would like to get involved in. So those you'll see for section C of the work programme. At the moment we haven't got any in-depth pieces of work, so those are things that as we start those they'll appear there on page 99. So Chairman, that's my suggestion to the committee, and in that order as well, because obviously we've only got a finite resource to achieve those. So I suggest we, especially for the first piece of work, the procurement exercise, we need to find out which members would like to be part of that lessons learned exercise, so then officers can work to get that in, as it's the time critical piece of work. Thank you, Chairman.
So the proposal for that is not so much a task and finish group, it's going to be just 1 or 2 discussion sessions? Sorry.
So some intense in-depth work. So it will be M&S work. It will be, it could be, my suggestion would be perhaps 2 meetings of in-depth work, looking at the lessons learned, the documentation that we've used before, and what could be improved, what could be better next time. So working group is probably too grand a term, because that suggests probably more than 2 meetings, but a discrete piece of work that we could then form recommendations out of, and then have those in line with whatever's going through executive eventually in that timescale that they've got for the procurement of the contracts.
So could I ask you to scope something up and share that with members, and then I think invite members to participate, and I don't really see why the number should be limited in this particular instance, as long as we can get enough members to provide meaningful feedback. Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. To my horror, I find just before the meeting started that actually I was probably going to be banned from the building for the next 12 weeks, sorry, because of my great age. So I think in planning these meetings, I would like very much to be involved. So I hope that we can take into account, and I don't know the full details of what I'm supposed to do or not do, that actually, as I say, I'd like to be involved, but we need to take into account that sort of issue. Thank you.
Annalise.
I would just say that there are a whole host of technological advances that we could use to facilitate a workshop with people on their iPads from their home and still be able to participate fully. So it would be a great opportunity to test that, and also a way to make sure that everybody who wants to be engaged is involved in the process.
The only problem with that, Chairman, is that everybody would have to make their own cup of tea.
I see tea here.
I think we could probably live with that. I think that's actually an excellent opportunity to trial what this council is committed to do in the future going forward. Not making tea, using technology. So if you're prepared to take it forward on that basis, then Yasmin, scope something up, invite members, and my view is the more the merrier. And if we have, and with provision for using technology, so that if senior members of the committee are precluded from joining us in person, they can join us both in spirit and online.
Well, I wonder whether the chairman himself falls into that category.
What? Never ask a gentleman his age. And the answer is no.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I can do that, scope that piece of work with the officers, and recruit members to that piece of work as well. Yeah. Okay,
so that's our top priority. We have to get that sorted out in time for the procurement to go ahead. So that's top priority. The second item I think I'm hearing from Mike is that rewriting work needs to go on in time for September on the allocations. So we do need to provide our input well before that then. Okay, so I'd suggest that we possibly have 2 sessions, one where officers take us through in detail. That's the morning with coffee and biscuits. And then we go away and ponder for a couple of weeks, and then we come back and we roll up our sleeves and we do the work for another morning session with coffee and biscuits. And that hopefully should lead to some constructive input, but a requirement to do some work. And that feels like it's probably got to be in July to give us time to have our summer holidays and then allow Mike. Will that work for you, Mike, at that time? Yes, I think so. July? Okay, so again, can I ask Yasmin to scope something up? And I suspect this one's possibly better to have a limited group of people and everyone volunteer and who wishes to, and we'll pick 5, probably 5 people from that. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes, Chairman, I can scope that piece of work as well and aim for 5 members for that working group, or that piece of work.
Councillor Baker, you're looking worried.
What piece of work are we talking about? Sorry.
This is the allocation scheme. So again, 2 sessions, a briefing session, a detailed briefing session with officers, 2 weeks digestion, and then coming back 2 weeks later for members of a working group to spend a morning with their sleeves rolled up, going through in great detail, trying to work out whether changes need to be made and additions. Let Yasmin scope something up so you can see what you're volunteering for, and then we'll send that out, and if that's okay.
Thank you. If it helps, Chairman, having just read everything that's in that document sort of effectively 6 times over in the past 24 hours, I would think the first thing that we need to do is to ask officers, so that first meeting, I think we need officers to inform us of any strategic issues that they believe should be incorporated or any new strategic direction they think that they would like to propose, because they're the experts on that, you know, on how the allocations policy should target, should react to the properties we've got and the people that are out there, because you know that far better than we do. And in that meeting, we will put in our own, you know, I've got my 2 pages of notes that I've made from here, which I'll happily bring along, and we can run through those. And then after the officers would then have hopefully a month or 6 weeks to go away and put together, you know, rewrite the document and get it out to us for us to read, and then another meeting for us effectively to agree for it to be put back in front of this committee and the executive in time to hit September, when somebody's got to tape record the lot or something like that. Is that right? Or do we do it electronically?
So I think the timings you're proposing might be a little stressful, given.
Well, we should be starting next month. So I would think we'll be starting within a few weeks, won't we, on this? So we can't wait until the July meeting to look at a scoping thing. We really want to be having our first meeting, I would think.
Well, the scoping will come out, but it's not going to be a traditional task and finish group. It will be a couple of focused scrutiny exercises.
I think we should do that within a few weeks, whilst it's relatively fresh in our minds, rather than. Should we not? Does anybody object to that? Or am I being stupid?
Well, only in terms of, you know, there's a limited amount of work people commit to, particularly given current circumstances. And it's absolutely critical that we get the responsive repairs contract work done first. So I think this naturally finishes. And we'll leave Yasmin to try and work out the timings and give us the maximum, to get the officer briefing at the earliest available opportunity and give us the maximum available time to our follow-up session that will allow input to go to Mike in time for his work. Does that sound reasonable?
I think, Chairman, I think it's a sensible idea, as Councillor Hyman says, to get some direction early on from officers as to what they think the direction the policy should take. I also think it's important that, officers get started on that as soon as possible. But in terms of the work by the committee members, I think the procurement exercise, as you say, is the priority. And then whatever we need to do with the allocation scheme will need to come through by September. We can do that.
I do think these have to run concurrently, because we can't leave this until we're happy with the procurement of, do you know what I mean? This has to be done alongside, surely. As a, obviously not given the same sort of priority as procurement, but it has to, if we leave this till another day, it's not going to be done by September. You know how the wheels turn slowly in the council. We've got to get going on it if it's all got to be sorted by September.
When we, so when I'm able to scope the pieces of work, then we'll see what resource they entail, and we can see when they can be achieved.
It doesn't have to be a complete rewrite or anything. It just needs, but things take time, and we need to get it in front of people, and then it's going to take weeks for officers to do the typing up of the changes and whatever, and change things around, and then we've got to go through it. Months have gone by, all of a sudden we're, summer holiday. So I don't want that to happen. I think we should start this bit of work as soon as we can, if you don't mind, Chairman.
Right, the message is loud and clear. I'm going to pass it on to Yasmin to schedule this, to give it the maximum amount of time, starting as early as possible without jeopardising the other piece of work. So the third piece of work is the housing design standards, and we're looking to start that after the summer break, at the earliest convenient opportunity. That will be a pretty heavy piece of work based on previous experience, a really enjoyable piece of work and well worth getting involved in, providing you're prepared to commit quite a lot of time. I think we had probably 5 or 6 sessions, typically half-day sessions. It included site visits. Apparently we can't go up to Norwich to see the passive houses up there because they're so fully booked. It's just about impossible to get anywhere near Goldsmith Street. But site visits nevertheless would be interesting, and there are passive houses dotted around Waverley, so we could possibly go and look at some. I don't know. Again, can you scope something up for us and get that out at your convenience? The important thing here is that it's all going to be time outside of school donated to this. So rather than asking for volunteers now, if we can get the pieces of work scoped up and sent out, then you can take a look at preferences, or how much you might have a huge amount of enthusiasm and want to be involved in all of them. But equally, if you're going to get involved, it would be great if we can have people turning up to all the meetings. Definitely need some tenants panels involved, tenants panelists involved in these exercises. Certainly the previous design standards had heavy involvement from the tenants panel. Really, really valuable. So if Yasmin can get these documents out to us, make up your mind what you'd like to be involved in, and do please step forward and volunteer, and then we can get these 3 pieces of work hopefully completed largely by Christmas, although the design standards I suspect is going to be quite a challenge because we're going into the wild blue yonder there. The low carbon homes is something we don't have the experience of, and we're going to have to do a lot of homework on that one. Is that reasonable?
Yes, Chairman, I'll work with Louisa to scope that particular piece of work.
Right, okay. Is everyone happy with that? In which case, not long after 9 o'clock, I'd like to thank Councillor Cole for both supporting as Vice Chair for most of the meeting and for chairing that one item, in spite of my attempts to stop him. And thank you very much for giving up your time this evening. Have a good evening, and look forward to seeing you shortly. Bye.